What do you believe are the most valuable things a tariqa or other spiritual organization provides its members?
Wow.
Encouragement and validation.
Sayyida Zainab adds personal guidance and practice.
Oh, well, sure.
Yes.
I mean, it's the personal guidance thing. You can practice anywhere in theory, but
As long as you know what to practice.
yeah, well, yeah, that's right.
And as long as there's some way of monitoring your practice so that you get it right or know the next step or don't get hung up in some blind alley.
Right. There's probably some value in the mirroring of things in other people, that, you know, there are some things you can sort of subtly pick up through that you might not come up with yourself.
Right. So, all right. So what's the value? Guidance, encouragement. I would like to suggest possibly going along with encouragement, community.
Yeah, well, sure.
And I guess this all is based on the fact that one has some idea of why one would want a spiritual life.
Yes, exactly. And this can show you why. I mean, being in a tariqa or equivalent.
Yes.
But, you know, there is something you get from being in personal contact with people that doesn't make it across the internet very well. And it helps to be reminded that other people are working on the same thing you are, and everybody's at a different place. So I guess that's why you kind of, in a group like that, get to practice the virtues, because everybody won't be acting the way you think they should. So it's a laboratory too.
Yes, ideally it's a laboratory in which things are tested.
Right. And you can walk in one Friday or Saturday night and have your own stuff tested. Talk to somebody else about it.
Well, yes, but I think there's also a large population that thinks the value of having a spiritual life is you don't have to do any of those things. All you have to do is follow the formula.
Well, yeah, that's a shame.
Take all of that personal stuff out of it.
Spiritual path is very personal, even though life is a lot more impersonal than we assume.
Well said.
So, I don't know. I've almost never felt a lack of community, but I know it's valuable.
Yes. And you know, for several reasons, not the least of which is that it encourages the continuity of the teaching.
Right, and it gives you a place to practice the spiritual virtues and things like that among people that hopefully understand what that's about.
Hopefully, yes. So it's access to doctrine and practice, leadership or guidance in terms of practice, and community in terms of support and continuity.
Yeah.
All those things seem like they're good reasons to be part of a spiritual path to me.
Right. Yeah, support's a good way to put it.
What are we missing?
Dressing up.
Always an opportunity to dress up.
I mean, that shouldn't be dismissed. People are part of groups like the SCA that don't really have a religious basis, just so they can dress up like people from the Middle Ages. So
Yeah.
Maybe there's something missing in people's lives, and maybe getting together with other people and having some sort of costume or outfit fosters togetherness in some sort of intangible way.
Right.
That's accurate.
And I think it also gives one a personal experience of living in two worlds, as it were, so that you don't think you're the same all the time. Adopting a role, a sacred role, or whatever, I think gives you perspective on the so-called profane life.
True.
And of course, dressing the same way is, community and solidarity and membership and good stuff. How else would I know how to tie a turban?
A good question, you might ask. So, Seda Badria?
I think you answered the question well. But I'd like to hear from Abby, since so far we've only heard from people in the Tariqa, and I think she might have an interesting perspective.
Well, my perspective has to do with my experience raising children. And when children become teenagers, they're looking to spread out from the community that is the family. In my experience, till they're 10 or 11, they're really happy with the family community. And then they want something bigger. And if there is not a good community for them to expand into, they'll expand into a bad community. So I don't know if your Tariqa has ever been big enough to provide that kind of community for children growing into the teenage years, but if it ever was in any place, that would be invaluable for families.
Well, we should be welcoming to them. I sort of feel like there's a certain level there are certain things you don't do without consulting with the parents, but but if you're friendly and generous and accepting and everything like that, that really helps.
We have third order religious groups. So if you want to be a Franciscan monk, that's a celibate vocation, but there's a third order for non-celibate people from all walks of life. So they're
lay order, is that what?
Third orders is usually how they refer to them. They're a lot like your Tariqas.
Well, it's good. There's a place for that. There's a need for it.
Yeah, and like the different Tariqas, each one has its own personality, its own temperament and calling and focus.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and 12-step meetings are the same way. Each one has a certain feel and a certain anyway, it's different. You can really feel the difference, even if most of the people are the same one.
Wait a minute, what was that? I have that last sentence again.
I said even they have their unique feel, even if many of the members in 2 meetings are the same.
I see. Yeah.
But if it's a different meeting, one that meets at noon, one that meets in the evening, whatever, it's going to usually have a different set of people, all trying to do the same thing you're trying to do. And it's good to know that there isn't just one way you can be.
Yes, that's very valuable. And as well as the converse of ideally some people you might like to try to be more like.
Yeah. Exactly.
I wish everybody could go to 12-step meetings. I spent some time with Naranon because we had a person with a drug addiction in our family. Yeah. And I learned a little bit from them about how to deal with the addict in my family, but I learned a lot about how to deal with life in general and difficult people. And, there's a lot of good spiritual psychology in the 12-step programs that applies broadly to all of life and not just the one problem at hand. Oh yeah.
Honestly, you can learn a way of living in a certain sense in a 12-step program. And one of the steps refers to practicing these principles in all our affairs. So it really is a treatment for one's life, not just instruction of how to deal with the person with the addiction. In the some of the best meetings I was in when I was doing Al-Anon, the difficulties that people brought up were pretty much always turned around so that you could take responsibility for your own role in whatever the situation is. And in the process, you get self-knowledge. You learn a whole lot about yourself.
Yes, and you get to deal with the only person you can really change.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
I mean,
That's what they
I
tell you.
yeah, well, when I started going, I said, well, this is a spiritual group, and it has its limitations, but it is spiritual if you let it be. Anyway, it tries to be.
Well, I know a little about 12-step groups, although I've never really participated in one. But I also remember Houston Smith writing eloquently about, who was it? Bill or
Yeah, Bill Wilson, Bill
yes,
W.
Bill W.
one of the, yeah, always seemed substantial to me.
Well, yeah. I mean, he and whoever the other guy is, I can never remember, and nobody much talks about. I'm pretty sure they authored the big book in AA, and there's just a lot of spiritual topics covered in there. As far as I'm concerned, it was a kind of lesser revelation for these people to recognize this and formulate it, because they discovered it in their own lives, in their struggle to, be an alcoholic but not drink.
I have no problem seeing it as a lesser revelation because
No, I don't either.
It's not directed to everyone, but it's been immensely valuable spiritually to those to whom it has been directed.
Yeah, well, is there any revelation that's really directed to everyone? Some of them are a little bit universalizing, universalizable.
A lot of them claim that.
Well, that's a different thing.
The word Catholic means universal. That's the literal meaning of the word.
Good point. Good point, indeed.
Well, and that's what the first church should want to be. But if you really expose yourself to any one of them, you can see how it can be universal if your personal context is right.
More comments on this one?
No, not from me.
Okay, shall we move on to the next question?
No.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Yes, Seda Badria?
Before we move on,
okay.
And that's why I was silent. What Abby said reminded me of a quote from Lawrence that I quite like. He was talking about the Catholic Church. He said, "Why not let it be the universal church of Muhammad as well, since ultimately God is one God. People speak varying languages, and each needs its own prophet to speak with its own tongue. The universal church of Christ and Muhammad and Buddha and Quetzalcoatl and all the others, that would be a true Catholic church."
Yes, but it's that's just not going to happen on Earth.
Well,
because of people.
Well, isn't that to some degree what perennialism is?
Yeah.
Perennialism is not a religion. It's no practice.
No, it's not. But yes, perennialism, it isn't a practice, but under D.H. Lawrence's proposition, you couldn't all combine those practices either.
No. And he actually is staunchly against that. But if you get, a bunch of Catholics and Orthodox and pagans and Muslims under one roof, and you make a community out of them with their unique beliefs and practices that all believe that their different paths lead to the one God, that is the universal church.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
And I think there have been a lot of times in the ancient world and relatively recently in the Middle East where people of different traditions were thrown together by whatever circumstances, and learned to live with each other and consider other people, some of those people to be friends and things like that. It can happen. I mean, it doesn't have to be under one roof. It could be in one village or town or neighborhood.
But it's still not one church because religion is different from belief. Belief has to do with doctrine, and religion has to do with your response to God in light of the doctrine. So where there's no unified practice, there's no unified religion.
Well,
so it seems to me.
Well, that kind of points back to the well,
That's why people who say I'm spiritual but not religious, it's like that's spirituality. Religion has to do with your response to God and your what you offer to God, or how you behave towards him, not just what you believe
right.
and what you do for your own benefit and that kind of thing.
But
And how you live your life when you know you're always in God's presence. You know, for a theist, it's kind of nice to know that somebody is watching you. In ordinary life, if you know somebody is watching, it changes your experience.
but I would say the etymology of the word religion is to bind
Yes.
to,
Good
and
point.
it's not just binding to God, but binding to communities. And in that sense, you know, I would say perennialism in the root sense could be a religion. Brother James was not the same religion exoterically as us, but he was esoterically the same. That's my perspective.
Well, yeah, that's true. You can. There's a lot of this stuff that makes religion exclusive that you can transcend. You know, there is a perennial philosophy, as that Aldous Huxley said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Aldous,
Yeah.
Leibniz, or what the term that I like. Who was that? Was that William Stoddart? One of the perennialists called it the underlying religion.
Sure.
I think that was Abu Bakr.
Okay.
Whatever. It's still good. Actually, it's probably even better. But
Yeah, probably better. Yes, there's an underlying religion, there's an underlying esoteric core, or a transcendent unity, as Shuan said. But that's a little different than practicing a particular form.
well, yeah, but a form is by its nature exclusive of other forms.
By definition, that's right.
Yeah. So, you know, you can't avoid at least appearing limited. Anyway, yeah.
I will say, you know, in terms of spiritual pitfalls, it's much more dangerous to combine practices than to combine doctrines, because by their very nature, all doctrines contain some truth. And even if you don't know anything at all and you willy-nilly combine all sorts of doctrines together, you're probably still going to come close to the truth as long as they're all true doctrines. But if you combine a bunch of practices willy-nilly, you could end up in a disastrous situation.
Right.
And if you pick out just the practices that move you or speak to you, or that you get something out of, and leave behind the ones that don't seem to speak to you, then you're going to miss out on the ones that aren't speaking to you yet.
Right.
Which are most of the time the most important ones. The ones that you don't like or that you're too lazy to follow are normally the ones that are most beneficial.
Yeah.
That is probably, that sounds true to me, but
Well, that's a general principle for life. I think you need to push against the things that you don't like,
Right.
to find out who you are.
Exactly. If you want to see something different, you have to act differently or look in a different way. I think combining religions, at least mentally, is like becoming polylingual, because you have different languages in which the truth is expressed. I know when I talk to people, most of the time I shift into Christian mode if that's an issue, and that's the vocabulary I use when I'm talking about anything spiritual. And if I were talking with a Jewish person, I might use what little I understand about that in my conversation too. But
and even more, they help you to understand yourself better. Just like learning a new language helps you to understand the world better and yourself better. Learning about different religions helps you not only to understand yourself better, but to see that unitary core underlying all of them. Because if you only know one religion, that's fine and good, but sometimes you can mistake the substance and accident. But when you know more about more religions, you tend to gain an intuitive ability to separate the grain from the chaff.
Yeah.
All right, so next question. We have talked a lot about what one can learn from practices and from philosophy, but what can one learn from daily life, i.e. non-religious practices, and how? You have mentioned driving often. What can one learn from driving?
Well, let me say, I think one can learn a lot from daily practices in the same mode that one can learn a lot from spiritual practices, which is to say, paying attention and being present and not evaluating it at that point, being open to the experience, fully participating in it, and Greg would say, celebrating it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I mean, daily life
that experience.
Daily life is where we spend most of our time. Why should we miss learning from it? Being a good observer. Now, one of the things that I do when I'm on the open road is try to only see and hear, but not think. So, try to put the narrator off to the side.
Yes.
What good does it do me if my mind says, oh, what an impressive pine tree? It doesn't add anything to the experience of the pine tree.
Right, and often in many ways, it's easier to get the mind out of the way if you're doing something.
Mechanical, especially.
The classics
and
are.
Driving is a little bit mechanical. So
driving is one. Walking.
Mm-hmm.
Running, showering is one.
Anything.
Yeah.
Be there for it.
Yes.
And see what it has to show you. It may show you something different than it showed you showed you yesterday.
Yes. I've often thought I got a lot out of, and still do, every now and then I get the chance to sort of watch my hands do the dishes.
Yes. That can be a good one. I've done that.
Other voices?
Well, I think religion is not separate from daily practices. It's really, or it should not be separate from daily practices. It should be embedded in everything that we do if we truly do it consciously. So, for example, if one is cooking consciously, then it's worship of the body. You're doing it because you're grateful that you have a body and mind to take care of. And you're doing it with the consciousness that this is a form of practicing religion.
All right. Zeta Badria, that sounds like an area that you might have something to say about.
I think ultimately it's about observation. So when one's performing one of these tasks, one should set oneself up for it. Find some quiet time, find some peace, and observe oneself, not just externally, but internally. And whether you're writing by hand or sharpening a pencil or things that I do, carving something from a block of wood, or even sharpening the knife that you use to carve the wood, can all be very meditative tasks. I'm reminded of that book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Everyday life can be our greatest learning experience. And if you turn everything you do in your life into a religious practice, it can be even more beneficial than some of the explicit religious practices.
Which can become rote.
Right. Whereas daily life is never rote. I mean, if you even so much...
attention.
Yeah, if you're paying attention when you brush your teeth, you have to realize the entire aspect of brushing your teeth is a miracle.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And it's not the same experience each time. To the extent it is the same practice, the same motions and things like that, there's still a difference in the person who's observing the brushing. You're not the same person from minute to minute. You're not completely otherwise.
Well, yes, but how could you be? It's the stepping into the stream twice.
Yeah, exactly. So you know, we tend to things that we do habitually. We tend to tune out, and we're tempted to spend our time lost in our mind somewhere while we do it. But that's missing a great opportunity.
I'm thinking from a slightly different angle that talking to somebody that you know really well is the best opportunity to transcend your own subjectivity, because if it's someone you know really well, you can see things from his point of view. And how marvelous is that? Here you are, a subject trapped within your own subjectivity, but you're getting past it somehow. And then if you're talking to somebody you don't know well and maybe don't understand, then that attempt and struggle to see things from that person's point of view instead of your own, that must be the most important spiritual work that there is, because it's about it. Well, you know, it's about ceasing to be the self with a capital, with a small s, you know, letting go of the I.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe that refers a little bit to what I call mirroring. It's like other people have experienced things in ways you don't, and if they communicate it, you may be able to see it that way too, initially to their account, but perhaps later all by yourself.
Perhaps, yes.
Interacting with your neighbor is something that you probably have to do in order to learn to love your neighbor.
It's so much harder if you have to actually do it. It's so much easier to love your neighbor if you don't have to have anything to do with them.
That's right. So it becomes just an abstraction.
Right, which we can be perfectly comfortable with.
Yeah,
and pretend we're living it.
Yeah, exactly. And then it just does nothing for us. It's important to realize every minute is new.
Yes.
And that you've never seen the same thing twice. You've never done the same thing twice. Once again, I remember good old brother Dave, who said, people say to me, do that again. You can't do anything again. You can do something similar. Obviously, that impressed me.
I ran into a good little exchange yesterday. I think this was in the wake of Abby sharing Sophie's movie.
Oh, did you get a chance to watch that?
Yeah, I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah.
It's about dying, or conscious dying.
Mm-hmm.
But it's either in that or in another exchange I saw where that went as follows. Someone is saying to a dying person, what's it like knowing that you're dying? And the response was, what's it like pretending that you're not?
Very good.
Just ran into that yesterday. Shall we graze on to a few more questions? Or
yeah. We have agreed that some form of doctrine is essential, but how much doctrine is needed and how much is too much?
Well, that's, I think, a very individual question.
Yes, but I would say doctrine is the materials from which you can build your interior reality. It provides a framework to at least mentally organize all the different aspects of whatever your path is. It is, yeah. I think it's the interaction and interdependence between the elements of doctrine that helps create a more singular, as it were, spiritual framework to live from or to understand what happened.
I also agree that it is a very personal question, because one could benefit from one doctrine as long as they put that doctrine in practice. Whereas on one hand, one could read hundreds of doctrine and not put any in practice. So what one most benefits from is what has been translated from the concept or the ideas in the doctrine to actual practice.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a good question to ask oneself about spiritual teachings or spiritual doctrine is, what if this is true? What would I do? How would I be?
I think doctrine can be a big time saver because it stops you from going down a lot of dead end roads. Like you
Yeah.
said about orthodoxy, Terry, that you know it gives you some direction so you don't have to reinvent the spiritual wheel.
Yeah, it's true. There are people who have been there before you, and they can describe parts of the path that you haven't set foot on yet or wouldn't know how to find. It's sort of like the best thinking already having been done for you, and as you say, you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
One thing that I think I've realized is that, we clearly are not living in a traditional world any longer. And if you present people with traditional doctrine, many people will recoil. And they already have to either have what has been called a calling, or have to have the veil torn away from their eyes, which happens very often because of tragedy or something else. But for many people that have not had that happen, I think one thing that's valuable is actually something sort of similar to what they use in the advertising industry, subliminal advertising, how there'll be a Coca-Cola presented to someone in a movie. And I think, works such as the novels of Philip Dick or Tolkien or some of these other writings can get people to read religious books without them knowing they're religious, and they subconsciously absorb this stuff.
Yeah. Well, another thing is that when you encounter something in doctrine that you can't understand or you can't see the good in, perhaps that's a blind spot rather than a defect in the doctrine.
Oh, good description.
Yeah.
Very good description.
So, why don't I see any value in this? Why don't I see where this belongs?
Well, that's one of those things where if you can ask the question, you're almost home,
Right. You have to know that there's a question to ask.
That's right. That's right.
But there's always a question to ask. And it boils down to some form of what's really happening.